In my years of studying the conservative mind and its adversaries, I have observed something deeply troubling: the transformation of classical liberalism into what can only be described as a form of intellectual pathology. What once represented a reasonable tradition of ordered liberty has devolved into an ideology that systematically destroys the very foundations of rational thought and moral imagination. This is not mere political disagreement, but a fundamental corruption of the human faculties that sustain civilization. Today, we must examine how this mental disorder manifests itself and why it poses such a grave threat to the permanent things that have guided humanity through millennia of struggle toward genuine progress. The symptoms are everywhere visible: the rejection of tradition as accumulated wisdom, the worship of equality as an end in itself, and the substitution of ideology for prudent thought. Understanding this pathology is essential for defending what remains of our civilizational inheritance against the forces of intellectual chaos. Chapter 1: The Corruption of Reason by Abstract Ideology. The first symptom of liberalism's transformation into mental disorder lies in its systematic corruption of human reason through abstract ideology. Where classical liberalism once sought to balance individual liberty with social order, contemporary liberalism has become a rigid dogma that subordinates all reality to predetermined theoretical constructs. This represents a fundamental perversion of the natural order of thinking, in which prudent minds examine particular circumstances before drawing general conclusions. I have witnessed this corruption throughout my career in observing how liberal intellectuals approach complex social questions. Rather than beginning with careful study of historical precedent and accumulated wisdom, they start with abstract principles: equality, progress, liberation, and force all reality to conform to these ideological demands. When facts contradict their theories, they reject the facts rather than modify their assumptions. This is precisely what Burke warned against when he spoke of the geometric spirit that would sacrifice living tradition to mathematical abstractions. The mental pathology becomes evident in liberalism's treatment of human nature itself. Classical conservatives have always recognized that man is a complex being, capable of both nobility and corruption, requiring institutions that channel his energies toward constructive ends while restraining his destructive impulses. Liberal ideology, however, insists that human nature is infinitely malleable, that all social problems result from defective institutions rather than permanent limitations in human character, and that sufficient reform can create a perfectly just society. This substitution of wishful thinking for realistic assessment of human capabilities represents a form of intellectual insanity. When confronted with evidence of human frailty, violence, or selfishness, liberal ideologues explain these away as products of systemic oppression or false consciousness, rather than acknowledging the tragic dimension of human existence that all serious philosophy must address. The consequences extend beyond academic theory into practical governance. Liberal politicians and bureaucrats, convinced that reason can be reduced to ideology, design policies based on abstract models rather than concrete understanding of how human communities actually function. They become frustrated when their programs fail to produce predicted results, leading them to demand ever more radical interventions to force reality into conformity with their theories. This represents a complete inversion of the proper relationship between mind and world. Sound thinking begins with humble recognition of the limits of human reason and proceeds through careful attention to particular circumstances, historical precedent, and moral tradition. Liberal ideology reverses this process, beginning with grandiose theories and demanding that reality conform to ideological requirements. Such thinking inevitably produces policies that violate human nature and undermine the social bonds necessary for civilized existence. Chapter 2: The Destruction of Moral Imagination. The second manifestation of liberalism's pathological development involves the systematic destruction of moral imagination, that faculty by which human beings perceive the difference between good and evil, beauty and ugliness, order and chaos. Classical education once cultivated this capacity through exposure to great literature, meaningful ritual, and the contemplation of transcendent truths. Liberal ideology systematically undermines these sources of moral formation in favor of relativistic thinking that denies objective standards of judgment. I have observed this destruction most clearly in our educational institutions, where liberal administrators have replaced the study of great books with ideological indoctrination designed to produce activists rather than thoughtful citizens. Students are taught to view all cultural achievements through the lens of power relations rather than appreciating their intrinsic worth or learning from their accumulated wisdom. Shakespeare becomes a study in patriarchal oppression rather than an exploration of universal human experiences. The Bible is dismissed as mythology rather than recognized as a source of moral insight that has shaped Western civilization for millennia. This represents more than intellectual error. It constitutes a form of spiritual vandalism that cuts students off from the sources of moral nourishment that previous generations took for granted. When young people are systematically trained to view their cultural inheritance with suspicion and contempt, they lose access to the imaginative resources necessary for distinguishing between worthy and unworthy objects of human devotion. The pathology extends into aesthetic and cultural spheres, where liberal ideology promotes the deliberate cultivation of ugliness and disorder as forms of political statement. Traditional architecture, music, and visual arts that once elevated human consciousness and connected communities to transcendent purposes are rejected as expressions of elitist oppression. In their place, we find deliberate assaults on beauty designed to shock rather than inspire, to fragment rather than unite, to degrade rather than elevate human aspirations. This systematic destruction of aesthetic standards reflects a deeper corruption of moral imagination that makes it impossible to distinguish between genuine art and mere propaganda, between authentic culture and manufactured entertainment, between institutions that preserve civilization and those that undermine it. When everything becomes a matter of subjective preference or political utility, communities lose the shared standards of judgment necessary for maintaining civilized discourse. The consequences are visible in our public life, where political debate has degenerated into competing forms of victimization rather than serious consideration of how to preserve what is good while correcting what is defective in our common arrangements. Liberal politicians appeal to grievance and resentment rather than inspiring citizens toward higher purposes, because they have lost the capacity to imagine forms of human excellence that transcend material satisfaction and political power. This destruction of moral imagination represents perhaps the most serious aspect of liberalism's transformation into mental disorder, because it undermines the very faculties necessary for recognizing and correcting ideological error. Chapter 3: The Tyranny of Egalitarian Fanaticism. The third symptom of liberalism's pathological evolution manifests in its transformation of equality, once understood as equality before the law and in fundamental human dignity, into a fanatical demand for absolute uniformity that denies natural differences and destroys the diversity that enriches human communities. This egalitarian extremism represents a form of intellectual totalitarianism that tolerates no deviation from its leveling imperatives. Through decades of study, I have witnessed how this fanaticism operates in practice. Rather than seeking to remove unjust barriers that prevent individuals from developing their unique talents and contributing according to their capabilities, contemporary liberalism demands identical outcomes regardless of differences in ability, effort, or circumstances. When natural inequalities persist despite social engineering, liberal ideologues conclude that society itself must be fundamentally restructured to eliminate all forms of distinction. Consider how this egalitarian obsession has corrupted education, where the recognition of genuine excellence has been replaced by elaborate systems designed to ensure that no student feels inferior to any other. Rather than challenging all students to develop their particular gifts to the fullest extent possible, schools now focus on eliminating competitive elements that might reveal natural differences in ability or achievement. This represents a betrayal of the truly democratic principle that every individual deserves the opportunity to discover and develop his unique vocation. The pathology becomes most evident in the liberal response to persistent differences between groups in various social outcomes. Rather than acknowledging that different communities may have different strengths, values, and priorities that produce different patterns of achievement, liberal ideology insists that all disparities must result from discrimination or systemic oppression. This leads to increasingly coercive interventions designed to force identical results across all demographic categories. Such thinking represents a fundamental denial of human nature and the principle of natural diversity that conservatives have always defended. As I have argued throughout my career, genuine conservatism recognizes that equality and inequality, the principle that all persons possess inherent dignity while differing greatly in talents and circumstances, provides the only realistic foundation for just social arrangements. When ideology demands perfect equality of condition, it necessarily destroys the freedom that allows individuals to pursue their particular excellences. The egalitarian fanaticism extends beyond individual differences to attack all forms of institutional hierarchy and traditional authority. Liberal ideologues view any situation in which some persons exercise authority over others as inherently oppressive, regardless of whether such authority serves legitimate purposes or operates according to just principles. This leads to systematic attacks on parental authority, educational standards, religious institutions, and cultural traditions that have historically provided structure and meaning to human communities. The mental disorder becomes complete when egalitarian ideology demands not merely equal treatment, but equal veneration for all possible choices, lifestyles, and moral claims. The necessary discrimination between worthy and unworthy objects of human pursuit gets branded as prejudice, making it impossible to maintain the standards of judgment that civilization requires. When everything must be considered equally valid, nothing can be genuinely valuable, and communities lose the capacity to transmit wisdom or maintain excellence across generations. Chapter 4: The Rejection of Transcendent Order. Perhaps the most profound symptom of liberalism's transformation into mental pathology lies in its systematic rejection of transcendent order, the recognition that human social arrangements must conform to moral principles that derive their authority from sources higher than human will or social convention. This rejection represents not merely intellectual error, but a form of spiritual rebellion that cuts modern liberalism off from the ultimate sources of meaning and moral obligation. In my studies of the conservative tradition, I have consistently found that sound political thinking depends upon recognition that human beings exist within a larger moral order that they do not create and cannot arbitrarily modify. Burke understood this when he spoke of society as a partnership between the dead, the living, and those yet to be born, operating under divine providence. The American founders recognized it when they appealed to natural law and divine authority as the foundation for legitimate government. Contemporary liberalism has systematically rejected these transcendent foundations in favor of purely secular and materialistic approaches to social questions. Rather than seeking to discover and conform to objective moral truths, liberal ideology treats all values as human constructions that can be modified according to changing preferences or political convenience. This represents a form of intellectual hubris that inevitably leads to moral chaos and political tyranny. The pathology manifests most clearly in liberal approaches to fundamental questions about human life, family relationships, and social institutions. Rather than recognizing these as arrangements that reflect natural law and accumulated wisdom about human flourishing, liberal ideology treats them as arbitrary social constructions that can be redesigned according to egalitarian or libertarian theories. Marriage becomes a contract between any combination of individuals rather than an institution designed to channel sexual energy toward procreation and child-rearing. Education becomes job training rather than formation in wisdom and virtue. Politics becomes the pursuit of material satisfaction rather than the cultivation of justice and the common good. This rejection of transcendent foundations makes it impossible for liberalism to provide coherent answers to fundamental questions about human purpose and social obligation. When all values become matters of subjective preference, there can be no principled basis for limiting individual desires or requiring sacrifice for the common good. Liberal societies inevitably fragment into competing interest groups, each pursuing its own agenda without reference to any higher standard of judgment. The mental disorder becomes complete when liberal ideologues actively attack the traditional sources of transcendent authority, religious institutions, classical education, and cultural traditions that have historically provided communities with shared standards of truth and moral obligation. Rather than recognizing these institutions as necessary foundations for civilized existence, they view them as obstacles to liberation that must be systematically undermined or destroyed. The consequences extend beyond individual confusion to social dissolution. Communities that lose touch with transcendent sources of meaning and moral obligation cannot maintain the solidarity necessary for addressing common challenges or preserving their cultural inheritance across generations. They become mere aggregations of isolated individuals, vulnerable to manipulation by demagogues who promise material benefits in exchange for political power. This represents the ultimate expression of liberalism's transformation into mental disorder, the systematic destruction of the very foundations that make rational social existence possible. Chapter 5: The Cult of Perpetual Revolution. The fifth manifestation of liberalism's pathological development appears in its transformation of healthy reform impulses into a cult of perpetual revolution that can never find satisfaction in any existing arrangement, no matter how just or beneficial. This represents a fundamental corruption of the prudential approach to social change that characterizes genuine conservatism and classical liberalism alike. Throughout my career studying political movements, I have observed how this revolutionary mentality operates. Rather than seeking to preserve what is good while correcting specific defects through careful reform, contemporary liberalism treats all existing institutions as presumptively unjust and in need of fundamental transformation. This creates a state of permanent dissatisfaction that makes stable social life impossible and undermines the very possibility of genuine progress. The pathology manifests in liberalism's approach to successful social arrangements. When particular reforms achieve their stated objectives, such as the removal of legal barriers to equal participation in public life, liberal ideology cannot acknowledge these achievements as genuine progress. Instead, it immediately identifies new forms of alleged oppression that require even more radical interventions. The goalposts constantly shift, making it impossible ever to achieve a condition of justice that liberals would be willing to defend and preserve. Consider how this operates in contemporary discussions of race relations. Despite extraordinary progress in removing legal and social barriers to equal opportunity, liberal ideologues now claim that subtle forms of unconscious bias and systemic racism require comprehensive restructuring of all social institutions. When specific metrics show improvement in outcomes, new theories emerge to explain why these improvements are illusory or insufficient. The revolutionary impulse cannot tolerate success because success would eliminate the justification for continued radical change. This perpetual dissatisfaction reflects a deeper spiritual disorder that makes contentment impossible and gratitude unthinkable. Rather than recognizing that all human arrangements involve trade-offs and imperfections that require prudent management rather than utopian solutions, liberal ideology promises perfect justice that can only be achieved through endless struggle against ever more subtle forms of oppression. The mental pathology extends to liberalism's treatment of its own achievements. Institutions that liberals once created or reformed, universities, civil rights organizations, government agencies, become targets for further revolutionary transformation the moment they begin to function according to their intended purposes. Nothing can be allowed to stabilize because stability would contradict the fundamental premise that all existing arrangements are unjust. This creates a paradoxical situation in which liberal movements systematically undermine their own successes. Rather than building upon achievements to create lasting improvements in human welfare, they cannibalize their own institutions in pursuit of ever more radical visions of transformation. University administrators who champion diversity initiatives find themselves attacked by activists demanding even more extreme measures. Civil rights organizations founded to achieve equal treatment under law are captured by ideologues demanding group-based preferences and separate standards. The cult of perpetual revolution makes genuine reform impossible because it cannot distinguish between legitimate grievances that deserve remedy and the inevitable imperfections that characterize all human arrangements. When everything must be constantly revolutionized, nothing can be preserved, improved, or enjoyed. Communities lose the capacity to build upon their achievements and instead exhaust themselves in endless cycles of destruction and reconstruction that leave everyone worse off than before. Chapter 6: The Substitution of Ideology for Prudence. The sixth symptom of liberalism's pathological transformation involves the systematic replacement of prudential thinking, the practical wisdom that considers particular circumstances and seeks workable solutions to concrete problems, with rigid ideological formulas that must be applied regardless of context or consequences. This represents a fundamental corruption of the political judgment that civilized societies require for addressing the complex challenges of human community. In my observation of political discourse over several decades, I have witnessed the gradual disappearance of the prudential approach that once characterized both conservative and liberal statesmanship. Where political leaders once sought to balance competing goods and find solutions that respected both practical constraints and moral principles, contemporary liberalism demands adherence to abstract theories that brook no compromise with reality. This ideological rigidity manifests most clearly in liberal approaches to social policy, where complex problems involving human behavior, cultural differences, and limited resources are addressed through simplistic formulas derived from egalitarian theory. Rather than carefully studying what actually works in particular circumstances and building upon successful models, liberal policymakers impose uniform solutions based on ideological requirements. Consider how this operates in education policy, where liberal ideology demands identical approaches to teaching all children regardless of their different backgrounds, abilities, or learning styles. When standardized programs fail to produce desired results with certain populations, the response is not to modify the approach based on evidence, but to intensify ideological conformity and suppress discussion of alternatives that might acknowledge uncomfortable realities about human differences. The pathology extends to economic policy, where liberal ideology consistently favors redistribution and regulation regardless of their effects on productivity, innovation, or social mobility. When such policies produce stagnation or unintended consequences, liberal ideologues respond by demanding more radical versions of the same approaches rather than reconsidering their fundamental assumptions about how human motivation and market systems actually function. This substitution of ideology for prudence reflects a deeper corruption of intellectual humility that makes learning from experience impossible. Where prudential thinking begins with recognition of human limitations and proceeds through careful attention to particular circumstances, ideological thinking starts with abstract theories and demands that reality conform to predetermined conclusions. The mental disorder becomes evident in liberalism's treatment of dissenting voices and contrary evidence. Rather than engaging with arguments that challenge liberal assumptions, contemporary liberalism dismisses all criticism as motivated by prejudice or false consciousness. This creates intellectual echo chambers that prevent the kind of serious debate necessary for developing sound policy and maintaining democratic institutions. The consequences extend beyond policy failures to the corruption of political discourse itself. When ideology replaces prudence as the basis for political judgment, democracy becomes impossible because there can be no genuine deliberation about alternative approaches to common problems. Everything becomes a matter of ideological purity rather than practical effectiveness, making compromise and collaboration impossible. This represents perhaps the most dangerous aspect of liberalism's transformation into mental disorder because it undermines the very processes through which free societies identify and correct their mistakes. When prudential thinking disappears, communities lose the capacity for self-correction that allows them to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving what is essential. The result is a form of political autism that cannot respond appropriately to social feedback or learn from the consequences of ideological experimentation. Liberal societies become trapped in cycles of policy failure and ideological intensification that make genuine reform impossible and threaten the stability of democratic institutions themselves. Chapter 7: The Assault on the Permanent Things. The culminating symptom of liberalism's transformation into mental pathology lies in its systematic assault on the permanent things, those enduring truths, institutions, and practices that have sustained human civilization across centuries of change and challenge. This represents not merely political disagreement, but a fundamental attack on the very foundations that make rational social existence possible. Throughout my life's work defending the conservative tradition, I have identified these permanent things as the transcendent moral order that gives meaning to human existence, the accumulated wisdom of our ancestors that provides guidance for present decisions, the institutions of family and community that nurture character and transmit culture, and the classical education that forms minds capable of distinguishing between truth and falsehood, beauty and ugliness, good and evil. Contemporary liberalism has declared war on all of these foundations. Rather than seeking to reform particular abuses while preserving essential structures, it aims at the systematic destruction of everything that previous generations considered sacred or inviolable. This represents a form of civilizational suicide that threatens to cut humanity off from the sources of wisdom and moral guidance that have enabled genuine progress throughout history. The assault manifests most clearly in liberal approaches to education, where the transmission of cultural heritage has been replaced by ideological indoctrination designed to produce revolutionary activists rather than thoughtful citizens. Students are systematically trained to view their own civilization with contempt and suspicion, cutting them off from the intellectual and moral resources they need for mature judgment and creative achievement. Consider how this operates in university curricula, where the great books that once formed the core of liberal education have been displaced by ideological texts that reduce all human achievement to power relations and oppression narratives. Rather than learning to appreciate the accumulated wisdom of humanity's greatest minds, students are taught to deconstruct and dismiss the very works that could provide them with the intellectual tools necessary for addressing contemporary challenges. The pathology extends to institutions of family and community, where liberal ideology systematically undermines the natural bonds that connect individuals to larger purposes beyond immediate self-gratification. Traditional marriage, parental authority, religious observance, and civic participation are all attacked as forms of oppression rather than recognized as necessary foundations for human flourishing and social stability. This assault on the permanent things reflects a deeper spiritual disorder that cannot tolerate any authority higher than individual will or collective political power. Rather than recognizing that human beings require connection to transcendent purposes and inherited wisdom for meaningful existence, liberal ideology promises liberation from all external constraints and traditional obligations. The mental pathology becomes complete when liberalism attacks even the natural foundations of human existence, biological sex, family relationships, and the distinction between civilization and barbarism. When ideology demands that reality itself be reconstructed according to theoretical requirements, we have moved beyond political error into a form of metaphysical rebellion that threatens the very possibility of rational discourse. The consequences extend beyond individual confusion to civilizational collapse. Societies that systematically destroy their own foundations cannot long survive, Because they lose the capacity to transmit wisdom across generations, maintain social solidarity, or distinguish between worthy and unworthy objects of human devotion. This represents the ultimate expression of liberalism's transformation into mental disorder, the systematic destruction of everything that makes human life meaningful and social existence possible. Only by recognizing this pathology for what it is can we begin the work of restoration necessary for preserving what remains of our civilizational inheritance for future generations who will judge us by our fidelity to the permanent things. Conclusion. The transformation of classical liberalism into ideological pathology represents one of the great intellectual tragedies of our time. What began as a reasonable tradition seeking to balance individual liberty with social order has devolved into a systematic assault on the very foundations that make civilized existence possible. We have examined how this mental disorder manifests in the corruption of reason by abstract ideology, the destruction of moral imagination, egalitarian fanaticism, rejection of transcendent order, the cult of perpetual revolution, substitution of ideology for prudence, and ultimately the assault on the permanent things themselves. Understanding these symptoms is essential for anyone who would defend what remains of our cultural inheritance against the forces of intellectual chaos. The conservative response must be neither despair nor mere reaction, but a patient work of restoration based on fidelity to those permanent things that have sustained human civilization through previous dark ages. In every generation, some must stand guard over the treasures of wisdom and truth that make genuine human progress possible,